What kind of guidance might those worlds I call forests suggest? And how can they orient us as we face the current specter of planet-wide ecological destruction? I approach this question as an anthropologist, that is, as someone who is committed to cultivating forms of radical listening as I move among modes of being that can at times dissolve me in my quest to understand what I am, amid a larger flow of life that vastly exceeds me. On m'écoute? Ça va bien? Okay. My goal here is to use what I thus might learn to help find an orientation for us, humans, in our attempts to live well in relation to the many kinds of others that make and hold us. Insofar as I'm concerned with forests as vast networks of emergent relations among beings, both visible and invisible, this is an ecological project. Insofar as I am aimed to explore what forests can tell us about what this kind of life more generally is, this is an ontological project. Ontologically speaking, this is an exploration into oneness, what it means and how we relate to it. As such, mine is a metaphysical claim of monism. That is, I hold that in the realm of mind, human and non-human, differences are second to oneness. They are not metaphysically prior. I'm also making here an epistemological claim, namely that we can, in a variety of registers, some formal, others more personal, come to know and feel ephemeral moments when oneness emerges. Inasmuch as my interest is in learning from these living forests a modality of conduct that can guide us as we make our lives beside and find our proper place among the living, the dead, those that may not neatly fit these categories and those yet to come, this is also an ethical project. Insofar as I'm committed to collaboratively finding concrete ways to allow this living force to be a continuing source of guidance, this is a political project. As an anthropologist, I immerse myself in this exploration through the one method that is both unique to our field and available to anyone, ethnography. By ethnography, I refer to a set of technologies for slowing down and liberating thought through a deep and sustained engagement with and attention to a place and the ways of thinking, human as well as non-human, it holds. This engagement is undertaken with a view to understanding how the kind of thinking that emerges ethnographically displaces and deforms the ways I customarily think, with the goal of finding appropriate representational vehicles for doing conceptual and practical work with that transformation. Moving among different and seemingly disparate modes of thought makes anthropology a form of shamanism. As such, its aim is to find the emergent frame that might unite these modes in the face of common concerns. This then also makes this project a diplomatic one, perhaps in Bruno Latour's terms, one that involves a kind of cosmic diplomacy. So the place that holds my ethnographic attention is Ecuador's megadiverse tropical rainforest. It began over 25 years ago with my research in and around the Quechua-speaking Luna village of Avila in Ecuador's northwestern Amazon region, and continues today in a much more collaborative vein with the Quechua people of Sarayaku and the Zapara Nation. Two neighboring communities in Ecuador's vast and forested south-central Amazon region, whose inhabitants up to now have concertedly, creatively, and successfully resisted the incursion of large-scale extractive industries, logging, roads, and colonization. These communities are cosmopolitan in every sense of the term. Not only are their members highly adept at moving in worldly circles, systematically developing sophisticated political and media campaigns, reaching out to Hollywood movie stars and world leaders ranging from popes to presidents, but their efforts to propose another way of living well are also guided by a deep conceptual engagement with the polity of beings, including especially spirits, of that vast world, cosmos, that they call forest. Sacha in Quechua, Naku, and Zapara. My current collaborative work involves as well a vibrant community of Ecuadorian lawyers, artists, environmentalists, and intellectuals who are also connected to these communities and are deeply concerned with and committed to the forests, its peoples, human and non-human, and what in some idioms is termed their rights. This ethnographic exploration has also somewhat unexpectedly led me to create an experimental archaeological museum in Quito, concerned with the collection of shamanic figures, primarily from the pre-Hispanic Ecuadorian coast. This museum seeks with Amazonian help to anachronistically capacitate an archaic form of animism for our times, recognizing that a central problem of our current geological epoch that we are increasingly calling the Anthropocene is time itself. Now, all of these projects are part of a larger one, whose goal is to develop technologies for opening us to the spirit life that emerges with and is expressed by the kind of world that is a thinking forest, and to find there a form of guidance that can be practically implemented today. So, thinking forests. The foundation for this ethical and political project is the research that culminated in my book, How Forests Think. This book is an ontological and diplomatic undertaking. It aims to make an ontological claim that forests indeed think, and to do the diplomatic work of showing how this simultaneously distorts, revitalizes, and unites in ways that are sometimes surprising Western scientific and Amazonian animistic understandings of life. I here briefly summarize some of the claims in that book. My concern less is with the claims as such, although making them in a robust way is very important. Rather, I'm interested in capacitating the counterintuitive properties of thought that a thinking forest expresses. The thinking forest is not a metaphor, nor is it a cultural belief. When I say that forests think, I mean that life is mind. What is distinctive about forests and the beings that compose them is that they robustly exhibit and express mental dynamics. Our Western metaphysics tends to arrogate mind-like phenomena, things like thought, language, culture, souls, spirits, to humans or our anthropomorphic gods. The claim here, by contrast, is that living dynamics also think, and that this thinking becomes so well expressed and amplified in complex, species-rich tropical forests that it becomes readily available for further thinking. Life thinks, but what then is thought? My argument is that it's something both larger than and different from what we take thought to be when we understand it only in terms of human thought. In a somewhat more technical language, my argument is that what makes thought a distinctive dynamic in the universe is its representational or representational quality. Thoughts and the living beings that think them are the outcomes of a process by which, in philosopher Charles Peirce's terms, quote, something stands to somebody for something in some respect or capacity, unquote. This representational dynamic involves signs and can be termed semiotic. And those sign-using somebodies, who are wholly made by such signs, are selves or minds, or in another idiom, souls, spirits, or persons, regardless of species. All evolutionary dynamics are mental dynamics. They are the only dynamics in the universe through which, regardless of substrate, be it Terran or Martian, something comes to represent that which it is not, with some sort of increasing fit. Life intrinsically thinks. It is synonymous with semiosis. What makes human thought distinctive is the ways in which it thinks through conventional systems of signs, known as symbols. Human language is the clearest example, and its logic forms the basis for so many of the things that we think of as uniquely human, like culture and consciousness. But this is not the only kind of thought out there. Life thinks through different kinds of semiotic modalities. Many of these involve relations of correlation or correspondence. For example, the ways in which a monkey's cry of danger is taken to indicate the presence of a predator. This kind of semiotic dynamic is termed indexical. But underneath that lies still another kind of sign process that is important to the life of thought. This one is a bit stranger, and in some ways forms the ephemeral foundation for all thought. And as such, it has become increasingly important for the way I strive to think with forests. This kind of sign process results from a specially constrained confusion, by which two entities are not distinguished, leading them to be interpreted as one and the same. So, for example, consider the cryptically camouflaged Amazonian katydid, Cyclopterus speculata. Thanks to its potential predators who did not notice its ancestors, it has, over evolutionary time, come to be invisible, as its members are increasingly confused with the leaves around them. The semiotic modality at play here is termed iconic, and iconism forms the foundation for how I think about oneness. Now, the important thing about iconic, indexical, and symbolic semiotic modalities is that they are nested within one another. Symbolic thinking emerges from and continuously relates to the iconic and indexical thinking that is proper to forests and other such ecologies of selves, as I call them. This means that although symbolic thinking is distinctively human and creates thought worlds that are increasingly separable from the world, it is never fully cut off from the non-human forms of thought from which it comes and on which it depends. This is crucial for understanding our relation to worlds beyond the human. Now, certain kinds of thought processes, like dreaming, are particularly interesting because they are highly iconic and indexical. And interpreting our dreams becomes an important site for the kind of cosmic diplomacy between that vessel that is our waking symbolic thought and the more dark and watery imagistic forms of thought that bears it along. It's no accident that so many Amazonian hunters cultivate dream interpretation as a way to understand their relation to the thinking beings of the forest. And it's no accident that the Amazonian concept worker, that Amazonian concept workers such as the Yanomami shaman and activist Davi Kopinawa locate the problem with whites and Western thought in an inability to think with dreams. The danger of symbolic thought is that because it depends on the creation of a sign system that is relatively separate and independent from the world, it encourages us to see the world dualistically. Our metaphysical mistake is to treat this separation as an absolute ontological reality, instead of understanding it as an emergent effect of a particular kind of sign process. The amplification of this dualism as a form of thinking and as a way of life has resulted in a large group of humans becoming increasingly separate from the world that holds them, to the point that we have, as Latour tells us, become a force of nature in this epoch of human-driven climate change that is increasingly, and to my mind appropriately, being called the Anthropocene. Note, when I say the Anthropocene, and I call it that, I treat that as a diagnosis, not a space that we should live in, but we're labeling something that's happening. It's not a hopeful name, it's a label. Thinking with the kinds of thoughts that forests produce, what I call sylvan thinking, is a way to put a brake on this kind of dualism. And this is why understanding this way of thinking is so important. Here I wish to highlight just a few of the elements of sylvan thinking that get amplified in a forest in ways that can become harnessed as a mode of thought for thinking for our times. The first involves ends, or telos. The emergence of semiosis in the universe also marks the emergence of end-directed phenomena. With life there emerges a self that comes to represent something for the sake of its future self. This is a minimal but real locus of telos. The second involves absence. As Gregory Bateson put it, in the world of mind, that which is not can be a cause. That is, representation, wherever on this planet it is found, involves processes through which that which is not present physically can nonetheless acquire a kind of causal efficacy. This absential quality, as Terry Deacon calls it, changes what we mean when we think of being and doing. The third concerns images or iconism. Forest thinking is highly imagistic, and harnessing the effortless, counterintuitive, and self-organizing efficacy of forms and patterns through which images work by, for example, cultivating modes of thought, such as dreaming, is one of our best ways to access this. Thinking imagistically is also highly personal. The only way to have an icon is to feel it for yourself, which makes this mode of knowing easily open to critique. Tacking between highly personal imagistic thinking and more objective third-person forms of argumentation that are more properly academic is also an aspect of the cosmic diplomacy that I seek to practice. Finally, Sylvan thinking involves the emergence of generals. We tend to think of the emergence of concepts, more abstract thoughts that join or subsume more specific ones, as something intrinsically human. This is the foundation for the philosophical position known as nominalism, which holds that categories come from the mind of human thinkers and not from the world beyond them. This is also the foundation for our traditional understanding of culture and social construction. But to return to the Amazonian katydid, with its evolutionary emergence, there is now more leafiness in the world. Leafiness is a real general, and it does not emerge from human minds or cultures. Biological species and lineages also exhibit this sort of general property, and I suggest in my own cosmic diplomacy that the forest spirits that are so important to my Amazonian colleagues and forest life more broadly are quite similar in this regard as well. Forest spirits are highly essential generals that imagistically manifest the telos intrinsic to a kind of emergent self that dense thickets of life can produce. Abduction and the continual emergence of mind. Now, I've talked about the kinds of ends that emerge with forests. I now want to say something about how this relates to anthropology's ends. Anthropology's ends is to create new concepts with the concepts that are discovered to be at work in the field. Crucially, what I'm after in thinking with forests is to discover the ways in which anthropology's ends, the goal of doing concept work, can be informed and guided by the concepts that emerge as we attend to the kinds of ends that forests produce and make manifest. The kind of concept work I'm after involves arriving at abductions. This is Charles Peirce's term for a third kind of inference, which he took to be necessary, a necessary complement to induction and deduction. So, recall that an induction is doing inductive work, is to find evidence for a theory, say for example, is an example of induction. Deduction is to use a theory to understand things in the world. But an abduction is something different. An abduction, according to Peirce, is the operation of adopting a hypothesis by virtue of an insight that comes to us like a flash. Abduction, for Peirce, then, is the only process by which a new element can be introduced into thought. It's the place where we get that new theory, that we get that new thought. It results in an idea that can unify other and heretofore seemingly disparate ones. And for this reason, he saw it as related to the icon. An abduction can eventually be inductively supported, and once established, made to do deductive work. So in his discussion of abduction, Peirce was thinking primarily of the kinds of reasoning involved in science and philosophy. But I see abductions as part of what Peirce, in a more generous sense, referred to as a scientific intelligence, by which he meant any kind of entity, human or non-human, capable of learning by experience. Semiotic life produces abductions. For example, the perception of depth that emerges by juxtaposing what two eyes see is a sort of abduction. It unifies two distinct and somewhat different ways of seeing in such a way that an altogether new way of seeing can emerge. So here's an example. This is a bit of a funny example of a potentially partial example of an abduction. This is a figure from that archaeological collection I was talking about. You can see sort of a jaguar shamanic figure. You can see the eyes and the mouth. If you invert it, another image emerges, which subsumes that other one. That one, the other face exists, but now you can see another larger face, a larger mouth, by turning it over. In some ways, that's sort of like an abduction. It's a larger image that holds other ones that form it as its part. Another anthropologist's goal, as a discipline concerned with developing methods of encounter that shake us into seeing the world anew, is to abductively grasp new concepts that unite prior and seemingly disparate ones in the flash of their emergence. Forests produce concepts. The Runa and other Amazonians produce concepts with these, and I try to do the same with these and others. Being abductively open, so to speak, is what it means to be alive to a living thought. It requires a constant ethos of self-effacement to be available to such thoughts, for we are unwittingly held by the concepts that make us. Ethnography is a technology for loosening the hold that these foundational concepts have on us, in order to find a position from which abductions can work on us. That is, we can never impose abductions because, as spontaneous moments of holistic emergence, we can never have them. They can, if we let them, only have us, as they make over our modes of thought. Being alive to a living thought also makes anthropology psychedelic, literally mind manifesting, from the Greek psyche, mind or spirit, and delon, to make manifest. For this kind of attention to the world can manifest to us mind or self in the quintessence of its selfhood. That is, it can reveal mind in its very mindedness, or in Peirce's idiom, in its continuous ability to grow and make itself anew as it lays aside old habits and takes up new ones. Grasping this in the world and in ourselves has the potential to shake up our own psychological sense of self, as well as the one that is formed by a larger, solidified set of concepts that hold us. Crucial to anthropological attempts to arrive at another abductively derived emergent metaphysics is a methodological refusal of closure, a refusal to allow the analytical frames we bring to the field to explain everything. The goal of such a refusal is to create a space where new concepts can emerge. Manari Ushigwa, the Sapara leader with whom I work and think closely, understands concepts to be gods. Every time a concept emerges abductively, there also emerges a god. When we come up with a new idea, and in the examples that Manari gives, to create a healing center or a new political organization, the idea is a god. It then takes real political work to ensure that this god becomes actualized. Such general concepts or gods also emerge abductively from the forest. When speaking in Spanish, they are often referred to as spirits, espíritu in Spanish. And note that the French esprit means both spirit and mind. Manari sometimes uses the Sapara term tsawanu. Sometimes spirits have generic names like forest lords, Sachaamu, or forest people, Sacharuna. Some are more specific, like Yaku, river, Alpa, earth, Waira, wind, and some have proper names, like Yatsao or Samara. In their constant attempts to be made over by those abductions not of their making, Amazonians make a practice of living with a kind of skepticism. One is never fully sure what kind of reality one is in, and what kinds of gods will reveal themselves as one engages with the worlds called forests. The only certainty is that we humans are never alone. What is more, any suspicion that we might be alone is a sure sign that we have become deaf, and soon perhaps quite literally dead to the world. I align this stance with the anthropological refusal of closure, an ethical commitment to allowing our way of knowing and being to be disrupted by understanding other ways of knowing and being. But skepticism aside, the shamanistic goal is to arrive at a form of understanding that will have a kind of resolution. Amazonians may spend a day anxiously unsure of how to interpret the vivid dream they had the night before, but when its juxtaposition with an event in everyday life suddenly reveals the dream's meaning. That is, when dream thought and waking thought come together in the abductive emergence of a new thought that unites them as one, there is for a moment, at least, holistic closure. Skepticism is part of the necessary path that thoughts take. Critique, however, is not where thought begins or ends. I am after an emergent metaphysics that will abductively unite the human and natural sciences with each other, and these with what force and those who dwell there could teach us in a way that can become the font for another way of living well. As such, this metaphysics will be a monist one. Psychedelic science. Achieving anthropology's ends of doing concept work with the concepts that the world manifests requires the cultivation of certain technologies of ethnographic immersion. Ethnography, then, as a method for abductively open concept work, is a psychedelic science. As such, it lends itself well to resonate with a mind-manifesting forest. Now, what a thinking forest manifests is mind's manifestation in the form of spirit. In the process, forests also manifest a scientific intelligence in the Persian sense. That is, they manifest how they are made of dynamics through which learning by experience is constantly taking place. The scientific method, with its form of hypothesis testing designed to mimic evolution, is a technology for thinking with the scientific intelligence already operant in places like forests. But there are other scientific technologies, modes of learning by experience as well. Amazonian dream interpretation and plant-induced visionary experiences are other such technologies. Their great advantage is that in their privileging of non-human semiotic registers, they already think the way psychedelic forests themselves think. Anthropology's challenge is to cultivate technologies to align our thinking with this kind of thinking, making it a kind of science that can manifest the mindedness emergent in the worlds I call forests. Central to our ability to appreciate the manifestation in us of this kind of mind is the dissolution of the little minds, our socially, culturally determined individual ones, held as they are by so many layers of personal and collective traumas, histories, and assumptions. I now turn to psychedelic technologies more specific to the Upper Amazon as a way to shed light on some of the contours that anthropology as a psychedelic science might take. In his eclectic book Pharmacopoeia, endorsed by none other than the beat poet Allen Ginsberg, Dale Pendle distinguishes between those kinds of medicines given to patients and those that doctors take. And these are the ones I'm going to focus on. By doctors, Pendle has in mind shamans. The Quechua term is yachak, literally knower, and in this sense, not so different from professors in universities or PhD students and things like that. The kinds of doctors we strive to be, whose aim is to diagnose those all too human ailments that also make us. Amazonian shamans are expressly tasked with doing concept work by moving among worlds, especially between spirit and everyday worlds, in ways that can affect something, to be it a cure or in darker registers a curse. They are cosmic diplomats. Shamans are sometimes referred to as medico. This is a Quechuazation of the Spanish word médico, which is the term for doctor in Spanish. Medico plays on a bilingual pun. Rico means a seer, someone who sees, in Quechua. Code switching between languages is also a kind of shamanism that abductively brings into view the ways in which a shamanic doctor uses medicines to see how a holistic world emerges from the fragmented experiences of multiple ones. Pendle thinks of these medicines that doctors ingest as poisons. It is interesting to note that in Quechua, the word hambi refers both to poisons, such as those used to tip blowgun darts, and remedies. These medicines are potentially deadly. They can threaten the organismic life of the doctors who take them in our attempts to dissolve the lives of the little selves that have accreted like husks around us. This makes such medicines radically other to us, and our relationship to them is more properly one of alliance rather than one of brotherly friendship. Medicines in this sense are potentially, in Donna Haraway's terms, odd kin. Their use involves cultivating an intimate relationship that always threatens the conceptual grounds from which we strive to relate. Difference is the road to oneness. These medicines force us to confront a sort of skepticism external to us, one that is experienced as alterity. That is, these medicines are, again in Haraway's terms, tricksters. Ethnographically speaking, the poisons, medicines, I have in mind are tobacco. The nicotine extraction from one cigar would, if injected, be lethal. Brought some tobacco. The more properly speaking psychedelic decoction, ayahuasca, literally the vine, huasca, of the dead, aya, and the alkaloid-rich paralysis-inducing deadly nightshade, wantu, which is considered essential to proper shamanic initiation in the Upper Amazon, and whose toxicity, for this risk-averse anthropologist, makes it too dangerous to even consider exploring. So I want to talk about ayahuasca, which has become, along with tobacco and dream interpretation, central to the psychedelic technologies I, in partnership with my odd-kin brother Manadi Ushigwa, am cultivating as we seek to develop methods for using representational technologies, especially writing, but also drawing, sound recording, photography, and video, in ways that can ethnographically express how the spirit life manifested by force can be a source of guidance. Now, it's one thing to venture to speak about something like ayahuasca. It's quite another to feel as I did one particularly terrifying night in Manadi's community, my human flesh peeling away as I became nothing more than a yawning jaguar's throat, channeling the force, cosmic life force, a tube-like conduit for the life that was flowing through a me that no longer existed in any embodied form I could recognize as my own. Taking ayahuasca seems to break down our symbolically structured sense of self. Every part of who we are as humans, insofar as this identity is held symbolically, dissolves. It's this self that must, for a time at least, die, in order for a new one to emerge. With the death of that old self, we are open to the many other non-symbolic forms of thought that our previous selves include. When we come back to ourselves, we do so having been abductively open to a larger ecology of selves that we can now recognize as intrinsic to the more capacious and ever-emerging self we really are and might continue to be. It's no surprise that psychiatrists are administering psychedelics to treat depression. If depression is a result of a process by which the self has become stultified by the endless recycling of the pasts in ways that limit our futures, a process that results in an alienation from the relatively more entropic mental states that allow us to feel the possibility of our own continual living emergence, then psychedelics seem to offer an opening. But I want to think about psychedelics as medicine in a broader sense as well, for they hold the possibility not just to reveal and rekindle our own mind's manifestation, life itself in all its emergent possibility, but they also allow us to see that emerging mind, our own, as part of the larger mind of a thinking forest, manifesting itself, a spirit. Now let me be absolutely clear, I'm much too much of a critically minded anthropologist to proffer exotic drug use as a self-help cure-all. Our remedies, especially medicinal and especially otherwise, will need to be homegrown, like a spring in Canada, with snow. Where's that Ontario guy? That's Ontario.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
No, it's wonderful. It's beautiful. That's the thinking forest right there. And yet, psychedelics can teach us something about the logical contours of the technologies we need to develop as we seek cures for a planetary depression that is associated with the humanism that is one of humanity's toxic byproducts. Ethics and the ends of forests. I am then ultimately concerned with the question of anthropology's ends in the more pressing sense to which this gestures. As we face the unprecedented threat of whole-scale human-driven ecological fragmentation at a planetary level, the continuing life of thinking forests and the thoughts that emerge from them is what is at stake. My claim is that the thinking forest with which we can learn to think can provide their own form of ethical guidance for living in the Anthropocene, and that anthropology, the study of the human, is in a unique position to address this. My title, the title of this talk, Forest for the Trees, points to this challenge, alluding to and tweaking the old adage that we are missing the forest for the trees. I claim that the emergent general assemblage of living thoughts called a forest can have something to say for the good of the trees. Now the word missing is missing from my title, but I hope to do work with its absential resonances. For the time we live in is marked politically and psychically by two things. First, a denial of the recognition that we were living with an impending ecological crisis. And second, a refusal to see how the worlds I call forests might provide a kind of spirit guidance as we face this crisis. Our times are also marked by a temporal anxiety. Marked, that is, by the sensation that we are missing the moment when we can still do something about the impending ecological, by which I also mean, in its broadest sense, social catastrophe that we earthbound creatures are currently facing. This is coupled by the uneasy feeling that our time is somehow out of whack with the other kinds of temporalities, geological and otherwise, with which it intersects at this moment. My title refers to trees in all of their woody sentience, but also by extension to the broader collectives or societies of beings that both give rise to forests and are held, sustained, and guided by them. We are all trees, and all of us tree-like creatures have a forest, by which I mean a spirit aspect to us. To think with forests and to constantly ask ourselves what good those thoughts that come from forests are for. This is an anthropological problem because it's a human problem. We humans are the ones who must continuously cultivate the art of listening to forests. This is what it would mean to ecologize thought. And it is we humans, many of us at least, who have stopped listening. The Amazonians I work with are less concerned with the ontological question of whether or not forest spirits exist, and more concerned with the ethical question of how to listen to them. For there are good ones and bad ones, helpful ones, and ones that are downright dangerous. And activating the right ones requires care, knowledge, and wisdom. Ethics, our understanding of how to conduct ourselves, is usually seen to be grounded either in human nature, or for social scientists, in the sense of socially constructed historical contexts that give meaning to certain forms of comportment. Now, without denying these dimensions, I hold that ethics has ontological tendrils that reach into the non-human world. That is, if we humans and our thoughts form part of a larger thinking world that holds us, then our modes of conduct must also emerge from and be guided by this fact. Ethics then has its footings in the non-human world. First, because the orientation of conduct based on the discernment of good and bad stands in a relationship of emergent continuity to the value intrinsically and uniquely expressed by semiotic life. For it is only with the emergence of life that one can say that there is something good or bad for the living self in question, and thus intrinsic to its mode of being. And second, because I also think that there is a way to discern at least some of the contours of an ethics in the imagistic thinking that forests produce. Just to be clear, I seek to derive an ethical practice from sylvan thinking. I am not trying to discern in it a moral code. Regarding the imagistic foundations of ethics, Peirce suggests that we should understand the philosophical study of ethics to be nested within a broader field of inquiry, which is concerned with the ways in which the ontological properties of the world that manifest themselves to us relate to ends. We'll just read that again. Regarding the imagistic foundations of ethics, Peirce suggested that we should understand the philosophical study of ethics to be nested within a broader field of inquiry, which is concerned with the ways in which the ontological properties of the world that manifest themselves to us relate to ends. For Peirce, the end of ethics proper is the discernment of a kind of good that results in an appropriate action. But just as for Peirce the logic of the indexical sign is nested within that of an icon, he took this kind of ethical good to be nested within and growing out of a larger whole that holds it. This whole for Peirce is something he called the aesthetic good, whose end is not an action but a feeling. What counts as beautiful or aesthetically good for Peirce has a formal resemblance to an icon. Remember that icons involve an interpretive process by which entities that might otherwise be distinguished are taken to be seen as the same. Recall also that this is the basis for an abduction, the inferential process by which a general concept suddenly arises to holistically unify seemingly disparate and otherwise fragmentary ones. Regarding the aesthetic, Peirce writes that, quote, an object to be aesthetically good must have a multitude of parts so related to one another as to impart a positive, simple, immediate quality to the totality. So it's my contention that Amazonian animistic and shamanic modes of thought also ground the ethical in the aesthetic, in the attempt to discern a mode of conduct from the general concepts or spirits that emerge from a forest. This involves immersing yourself in the free-form play of highly entropic thought via dreaming and other psychedelic technologies, such that a holistic image can emerge that can then serve as a guide for conduct, and it thus shares formal properties in common with what Peirce called the aesthetic good. So that may seem a little bit abstract, but I want to illustrate it with a very concrete example. Last year, Manati was in Montreal to take part in a research project, bringing Indigenous leaders and academics together to discuss issues of environmental conflict. As part of his visit, Lisa Stevenson, who teaches anthropology at McGill, and I organized a workshop where we screened an experimental film by the Quebecois artist Philippe Léonard. That film was about the 216 Fort McMurray fire in Alberta, which burned close to 1.5 million acres of forest. Philippe was there during the fire and made a powerful film called Ayahuasca, one that to my mind went directly into Sylvan thought. Without context or explanation, it uses images to lead one directly into what it feels like to be a forest under assault, and to also feel the infernal, quasi-agential forces responsible for its destruction. And I want to play you a clip of that film, so you have a sense for it. So I wanted to hear Manati's thought about this film because I took it to be an instance of image manifesting spirit in the context of environmental destruction. Manati's reaction before the audience we assembled made me realize just how inadequate my ontological curiosity was. The film, he told us, provoked in him a sense of becoming literally disembodied. Echoing his experience of ecological fragmentation, he felt one of his, when he was listening to it, he told us, he felt one of his arms flying off across the screening room in one direction, another arm flying off in the other direction. He felt his head floating above, leaving his legs to disperse below. Now this appears to be the exact opposite of what Peirce called the aesthetic good. For Peirce, recall, the aesthetic good is the result of an emergent image in which parts come together to form a whole. In focusing exclusively on the ontological as such, I had missed the ethical. For Manati, the film was conjuring real spirits, but in a bad way, because they were breaking his self into pieces, and thus impeding his ability as emissary of the forest spirits to make manifest in himself a kind of larger immanent emergent self that can guide us. Now, Manati's work, of course, does not stop with the ethical. For actualizing the ethical, translating concepts into action, takes real political work. In Sarayaku and Sapara territories, this necessarily involves finding ways in which the spirit world can guide struggles or organize against constant encroachments by government-sanctioned extractive exploration, and all of the nefarious ways in which this makes itself manifest, from shamanic attacks, arson, beatings, and death threats, to interactions with shady company-employed community relations personnel. For Manati and other Amazonian concept workers, it also involves the complex process of working with these concepts in national and international legal and political contexts that draw on their own concepts with the goal of abductively discovering their own role as cosmic diplomats in articulating local concerns as expressions of planetary problems. So just to conclude, Forest for the Trees is an attempt to channel a spirit guidance that emerges from the dense ecologies of selves, whose holistic mind-manifesting properties are themselves emergent. As such, I am not its author. I, along with others such as Manati and other Amazonian concept workers, are striving to find the technologies and idioms through which forest mind can become manifest through us. The end of this endeavor is to find practical ways to allow Sylvan thought's dynamic of self-making, unmaking, and remaking to continue to have a life. If this is a worthy endeavor, it's because it is faithful to something about us and our world that we already know.